This patch could be a make or break patch for Marvel Snap. This might be the patch that saved the game. Let's see what they've got in store for us, because this is extra long and extra large. Thanos has been a pretty clear outlier among decks in this current lull of a metagame period between OTAs, and that makes sense in the sense that they are targeting Thanos pretty hard with this OTA. There are 3 nerfs in this patch that look like they're fairly reasonably described as targeting Thanos and some of his major supporting pieces. They are taking a draw off of the Time Stone, first of all, and I think that is a very, very solid option. Time Stone to me was sort of the best of the stones not named Mind Stone, so if you're not going to deal with Mind Stone, dealing with Time Stone might be the appropriate thing to do. Since Thanos starts in your hand, Time Stone was basically always the correct stone to play if you had to play one early. Being able to get that discount on your 6-cost card and make it 5 was shockingly, incredibly relevant, and of course, drawing a card while you're doing that is among the strongest effects in the game. Thanos' discount is an underrated part of his power. Because he starts in hand, a lot of the time what you'll notice when you play against a Thanos deck is if you Mobius away the Time Stone, they very often don't play Thanos. One of the strengths of the Thanos deck is that between Time Stone and, of course, having Wiccan, they're able to do things like play Thanos on 5, or play Thanos and some other stuff. When you relegate Thanos to just being a win one lane card, even if he's at his maximum 22 power, that's a much easier thing for your opponent to deal with than it is to deal with Thanos and, oh, by the way, also the other stones that you were missing. That's the kind of thing that taking the draw off Time Stone hurts. Now the question is that going to be enough? Because I do think they picked the right stone to hit because of this. I also wonder if this could have knock-on effects for, like, okay, now your Time Stone draws, they're less good with Wiccan, because a lot of what makes Thanos good right now, or at least a part of it, is that your stones are all cycling, you have a bunch of good 2s, you cycle your stones and your 2s, and then you play Wiccan, and then you're cheating even more energy. So I do think that this should be a meaningful hit to Thanos. It's a question of just how meaningful it's going to be. And in large part, that is because Thanos decks always function as more than the sum of their parts. There's like little interactions that matter a ton. And so I want to see more parts hit, and luckily for me, and for you, if you are sick of Thanos, a couple other major parts of Thanos decks also got hit. I will say that this nerf to Captain America Sam Wilson is among my least favorite they could have applied. To my mind, what this does is make Captain America Sam Wilson a downside to have in your deck unless you draw him. I don't think that dynamic is something that encourages people to play this card, but it is something that might make Captain America Sam Wilson a lot less of a major player in these games, because there are still going to be decks that are willing to play Captain America Sam Wilson because of additional synergy. Ongoing decks are still just going to be happy with the body. Thanos decks with Mockingbird are still just going to be happy with the discount. But there is a meaningful cost applied to him here, in that effectively, if you don't draw Sam Wilson, what you're doing is starting the game with a rock on the board. And that's an interesting thing to ask people to do, I think, but it is as far from the promise of what Sam Wilson was as a character as I think you can get. My personal choice for this would have been to cut his scaling off, make him a 2-2 that gains +1, or a 2-3 that gains +1, and keep the +1 here. But it seems that the Marvel Snap developers have gone with the much, much harsher nerf of making the shield have no power whatsoever, effectively ongoing rock. Now, I do think that it's possible there are going to be some decks that are still interested in playing Sam Wilson. Strange Supreme, maybe. Thanos, maybe, because of Mockingbird, and of course the ongoing builds that just really care about positioning. But I think that this matters more than people are willing to give it credit for, because when you look at a card like Captain Carter was a card that, even if you didn't draw Sam Wilson, you knew that you would have a better chance at a fuller lane, there would actually be points there. And also, I think a lot of stuff, the things Sam Wilson enabled were like early priority shenanigans. Now, I totally understand if you want to say early priority shenanigans shouldn't be a thing. But when you look at what this is a nerf to, I think this is a nerf to Captain Carter. I think this is a nerf to Negasonic. I think this is a nerf to a couple of things that like didn't necessarily count on having early priority, but got a lot better when you did. And I think that that is going to have some knock-on effects. I guess they finally came to the conclusion that it's impossible to make a balanced patch as the pirate, even in a game where you are 100% gated by your board space and don't have the ability to value trade. I would have tried some other stuff before going to this. I consider this a very drastic hit. I'm really not sure how good he's going to be in the future. Like, this is like, I think maybe the only decks that will play him are the ones that are explicitly turning a downside into an upside, and I'm not sure how common those are going to be. I'm really interested to see what ends up happening with Sam Wilson with this change. Strange Supreme is losing a point of power, which I find a little bit odd. I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say, what are you talking about? This guy's like a 212. When is losing 1 power going to matter? And I'm tempted to agree. Like, this is a guy who cares so much more about his scaling than his base stats. I can see 1 power mattering, but 1 power matters less on a guy like this than it does on a bunch of other stuff. Although I will say, like, we've seen cards similar to Strange Supreme, like Thena, lose a power and go to basically entirely balanced. And I think that this, in concert with some of the Thanos nerfs, like, I wouldn't be shocked if Thanos is still a deck. I would be pretty shocked if it was still the deck. I think it was the deck by a fairly small margin, and I think the Strange Supreme version of Thanos was the deck by, frankly, an even smaller margin, thanks to a fairly poor matchup into both ongoing Thanos and Afflict. I think that this is roughly a balanced card right now, even in the context of Thanos. But what this should do, and why I like hitting Strange Supreme as opposed to like hitting Thanos again, I do like that it's specifically targeting the card that subsidizes the tech Thanos. Because in as much as there is a problem with Thanos, I think a lot of that problem was between Strange Supreme and Mockingbird, you were just getting a bunch of free power from your stones. And when you're getting a bunch of free power from your stones, you have the latitude and ability to just pick and choose the relevant, correct tech cards for the game you're playing, while the other ones sit in your hand because your stones are turning into free power. And so I think that this is a good direction to go, in large part because it gets rid of some of the interactions that make sort of what we'll call colloquially Thanos as Sarah control a playable and good deck. While I think a lot of people look at that deck and say the problem is the tech, to me the problem isn't the tech, otherwise Sarah control would be good. The problem is the subsidization of power that allows that tech to be an option rather than like a required card. One of the things that happens in Sarah Control a lot is you have these like big clunky Shang-Chi and Enchantress in hand, and if they're not relevant, you're not outputting a lot of power. What Strange Supreme does and what Mockingbird does is give you free power, which allows you to then choose the right options and not be as punished for just having a bunch of tech cards in your deck. I think this is a good direction to go. I will say, I don't know if Thanos is going to be quote-unquote solved until Mockingbird doesn't work in the deck. I think this is a good direction, but I do still feel like, you know, you're still going to lose to like 2-cost Mockingbird and an Enchantress, 2-cost Mockingbird and a Shang-Chi. That stuff is still just a really strong thing. Between the Time Stone nerf, the Sam Wilson nerf, and this nerf, I am confident that it's going to be a weaker deck. I just don't know that it's going to go away entirely as much as people, I think, are hoping for it to go away in a patch like this. This is an unbelievably cool change and a very, very risky one, but it is the kind of thing that can really shake a metagame up. Cerebro going back to 3-cost, gaining +3. Now, this does a couple things. The first thing it makes me think of is, okay, what is the stupidest thing I can do with this? And the second one is, how small can we get now? We've seen Cerebro 4 be pretty damn solid. There's a million different ways to cheat energy on really cheaply powered cards like Cerebro. So like Ravonna Renslayer makes sense. We probably need to be playing Luke Cage. maybe with Cerebro 2 being a legit option here, we could be a Cerebro 2 deck. We could be a Cerebro 3 deck with Luke Cage and Mobius and things like that. I think that this is going to be worth trying. Legitimately, I think it's going to be worth trying. Cerebro seems like it's going to have some legitimate ability to compete in a metagame, which I don't think I've ever seen before. This is something that, unlike the change to 2 cost, actually makes me interested in playing that. And I have never been interested in playing a Cerebro deck on the merits before. This is the first time I've looked at this card and said, there is probably something here. Mass +3 is just straight up a good thing to do. I think you're going to want to be building this deck for like min rolls. You're going to want to avoid min rolls, so you need ways to like contest locations, things like that, but like Luke Cage and Mobius being part of your deck and then gaining power is a classic methodology to achieve success in Marvel Snap. This is a deck that gets to use Cerebro to supplement tech, so you can have, you know, Luke Cage, Mobius. Yes, I know Luke Cage has 2 power. You're running him anyway. You are a Cerebro deck. But Mobius, Shang-Chi, Scarlet Witch, using power to supplement tech is a really powerful thing to do. Being able to do this should be a big deal. I think there is a real shot for a deck like this to succeed. A pretty wild change that maybe has been a long time coming. Hazmat going from a 2 cost to a 3 cost, and I think this one is going to be fairly impactful. They noted in the notes that Hazmat is the best deck against Thanos, or the Afflict Hazmat deck is the best deck against Thanos. They weren't specific about which kind. I suspect probably the high Evo one, but who honestly knows? Hazmat is core to both of the versions of Afflict. This is the Afflict card. I think what this does is push Surge into a more prominent spot in Afflict lists, most likely, because now your discounts are really impactful. One of the things that you really notice, though, is that you don't lose out on the ability to play Luke Cage and Hazmat on the same turn. You are going to have this as a more valuable hit off of an anti-venom now. It's going to feel more important, but it is a nerf to the deck. I will also say that, like, the main thing that this causes problems with is something that Surge goes a long way towards alleviating, and so does Zabu, and that is largely that it is awkward to play 3s in a deck like this because your 4s are so good. But if you're able to discount your 4s to 3s, suddenly you can do a 4 and this. It doesn't feel nearly as bad. And things like that are probably going to mean that this deck is still around. This deck is still playable. It'll still probably be a good thing to do because the power of the cards involved in it, even outside of Hazmat, is just very, very high. Between Laufey and Man-Thing, there are just 2 incredibly game-winning and lane-winning 4-drops. Anti-Venom and Malekith both effectively make something free and get it in your hand or in your deck. There's just a lot going on here that's very, very strong, which is to say nothing of the power levels that Ajax himself can reach. Making this deck move further up the curve is meaningful, but I don't think it's going to do enough to get Afflict out of the metagame entirely. I think if you wanted to do that, you'd be buffing Luke Cage. Honestly, I just see this as kind of a deserved nerf. They call out Afflict as like basically the second best deck in the game, and it has a good matchup against Thanos. It's honestly a little bit surprising how few people talk about and or play this list. It's just been consistently good for a very long time, and I think this is probably the kind of thing that needed to happen at some point. This one, on the other hand, I think of as a little bit of a surprise. Sauron was good. I don't want to sit here and act like Sauron wasn't good. He's a very good card as a 2-drop, but I think this is a deck that always had a lower play rate than it was good. In other words, it was better than its play rate, which is probably why they're nerfing it. But to my mind, something like this just isn't a problem that has to be solved until it's actually a problem. And I also think that Sauron is sort of only like specifically a problem at like relatively lower levels of play, which is in large part because of the way the deck plays out. It's a very easy deck to play. A lot of the time when people ask me what deck I'd recommend, they think I'm going to say something like Thanos or whatever, but if you're climbing 2 infinite late in the season, Sauron is just a really good choice because, let's be honest, not only are most people not super try-hard, they're also maybe not super paying attention. Sauron is the perfect deck for you to play when you're, like, engaged in watching a TV show, too, and you don't want to have to focus on all of this weirdness. It's sort of the opposite of Move Bounce, where I would expect a rank 70 player playing Sauron to be exactly as good as the person who's 70 infinite playing Sauron. Like, not a big gap here, whereas I would expect a rank 70 player playing Move Bounce to be meaningfully worse than like a rank 70 player in infinite playing Move Bounce, right? Like, I think that there is a very flat skill curve for this deck that is mostly based around turn 6 placements and things like that. And a deck with a very flat skill curve, I think they over-nerf decks like this. You look at what happened to Darkhawk, you look at previous nerfs to the Surtur package, right? Like, they are very tuned in to decks that make sort of the wider play experience, not necessarily my own niche at the top of Infinite, a problematic thing to deal with. And I can see that argument for Sauron in that context. However, I still think that it's not really a problem until it's a play rate issue too. And I don't think that this deck had the play rate to be that much of a problem. I think they could have left it alone and let it be what it is, but I understand that due to ease of play and a very, very, very high skill floor, I can understand hitting a deck like this, especially if it's hitting the numbers that it's hitting. Now, this is still probably a good card. Like, it's just not free anymore, right? As a 2/2, it was doing everything, and they didn't feel like they wanted to bring it back to a 3/3 for reasons I don't exactly understand. So what they've done is make it a, like, souped-up 0. It hits your entire deck as a 1/3 now, and that, I'm not going to sit here and say it's better, because it's harder to plan from inside your deck, but I think that's a meaningful thing, right? It takes this from a deck that is like very high skill floor to suddenly a deck that has to plan from inside the deck. It has to plan for its top decks. It actually is a pretty sneaky way of lowering the skill floor and maybe raising the skill ceiling. It's an interesting move, and I kind of like it. This is a pretty funny nerf if you look at it in a vacuum, but if you look at it in context, I think this one makes sense. Makari losing a point of power, I think, is sort of a pair with the Sam Wilson shield losing a point of power, where it's like, they feel, I think it's pretty clear, that there's just a little too much like, oh, I'm gonna have Sam Wilson and Makari, and I have priority, and then I'm gonna Negasonic you, and it's just like, I think they just hate that. I think they just hate that there are these cards that are sort of front-loading the experience of learning about priority to early turns of the game and making it really unpleasant while doing so. Surfer's been a good deck. Surfer is a good deck. Surfer will almost certainly remain a good deck, with or without Makari. Surfer has just been around this entire time. If we're doing NBA comps, I've seen a lot of people saying Surfer is Steph Curry, because, I mean, threes, right? But it also speaks to longevity. That is a guy who's been playing at a high level for a very long time. He's 38 years old now, and he's still doing incredible stuff. And I kind of think that that's what's going to happen with Surfer. I don't view this as a big hit to Surfer. I think Surfer will be absolutely 100% fine. If there's one thing that Surfer does not need right now, it's a billion points. With Captain Carter already providing that, and with a nerf to Thanos making Juggernaut potentially a lot more relevant, I kind of think Surfer is going to be in a good position regardless of this nerf. So, in the notes, they talk about what they did with Storm. And what they did was they made it so you can't Legion a flooding location and then have all the locations be flooded. And then they took Storm down to 3/2. And so I realize I've written Suck It Legion here, but honestly, as far as I can tell, this still lets you storm War Machine Legion. You just storm and then wait for the location to flood. You play the War Machine, and then you can play Legion on a flooded location, and that will still work. So as far as I'm concerned, they've brought back Storm War Machine Legion. And I realize that there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Storm War Machine Legion, but I'm going to start with the top line, which is, yikes, that's a really scary thing to do. I have always been more in favor of Storm War Machine Legion than others, because I view this as a sort of splashable package that allows you to have like a clog type like end game in a non-clogged deck, which is useful for mid-range decks in a world where people are playing a lot of combo, right? Like, if you want to beat Hela, if you want to beat, let's say, a Mr. Negative deck, Storm War Machine Legion gives you snap equity in those matchups where otherwise it's kind of hard to have that. And so I've always been less of a Storm War Machine Legion hater than I think others are. But I do think it's really risky to bring back just in terms of there's a reason they got rid of it. I've always been more okay with this combo existing than other people have. That isn't to say that I'm right. I'm wrong about a lot of stuff all the time. I spent 2 hours yesterday eating Captain Crunch and watching Gossip Girl. I ain't shit. Like, this is a dangerous thing to exist. And so this is a very, very, very scary thing that I expect to see in a ton of decks, honestly. Like, Storm War Machine Legion, I mean, like, Good Machine instantly becomes a contender again. Immediately becomes a contender again. Like, this is maybe the most impactful change we'll see in the entire patch, even in counting all of the Thanos stuff. It's going to make people want to play location control. It might bring Nocturne back. It might bring Scarlet Witch back. People playing Scarlet Witch in their Cerebro deck's going to be massively rewarded. We have tools to deal with this. It's going to be relevant. Are we going to sit here and act like Storm War Machine Legion's just going to be nothing? It's going to be around, and people are going to be very upset about it. That's just where it is. I think it's an okay thing to exist on balance. I don't know if it's an okay thing to exist on vibes. Toxy Doxy going up to 2-3. Now, there is probably something to be said for this card now, because this is now effectively a 2-7. It's not very good on turn 5, obviously, but this is actually probably a legitimately interesting card to put in your deck now, and I do think that does matter. Toxy Doxy is a fair enough and strong enough card that I am going to think about it. And before you take it from just me, just know that you all doubt me on this, but the one person I know who has been playing 2-1 Toxy Doxy is Butt. And I'm not going to go out here and say he's right all the time, but what he is pretty much always on is he is finding underrated stuff. And I got to tell you, if a card that Butt plays a lot of gets a 2-power buff, that's probably going to be a legit good card in an upcoming metagame. Obviously, not all metagames are suited for this card, and maybe her downside is still strong enough that it might be kind of an issue. But in a world where we're already looking at playing Storm War Machine Legion, I can see a real future for Toxy Doxy. I think they're just going to keep on slapping points on Annihilus until he starts to exist again, because this is a card that, like, people love complaining about Clog, but nobody loves playing Annihilus, right? And I think a lot of that is, it's sort of a consequence of, like, A, people are really used to, like, having a bunch of stuff that fills up lanes, and B, there's just a lot of good decks that have natural anti-Clog stuff built in, where it's like, okay, you know, I'm playing a Sentry, I'm playing Annihilus, I really hope you don't fill up that lane, because if you do fill up that lane and then have the ability to add more points to it or move stuff off of it, my whole plan sucks. And I think that issue is still going to exist, so I'm just happy to get some points on Annihilus and make him feel like less of an embarrassment to include in the deck. Like, this is just a very easy buff as far as I'm concerned. I think it is a strong card that, especially if you really hate Clog, is going to be a worthwhile strategy to build around, and giving more points to stuff that, like, puts Clog in a dumpster and gives it a noogie, that's always going to be a plus from me. Minor buff to Hercules, but honestly, I've already been seeing more Hercules, and this could be an interesting sort of test case for, is this kind of thing actually good? Hercules is now no longer stealable by your opponent. And this was actually particularly relevant to his performance in the current meta, because a lot of what would happen is like, oh, well, I'm playing a move deck, I don't really have priority, they move their Sam Wilson to the Hercules lane, and they steal my Hercules proc. That can't happen anymore, and that does matter. Whenever they make a card more controllable, wherever they make a card that is more guaranteed to have specific outcomes, that almost always makes the card better for the people that are choosing to play it, because they are then more able to understand snaps and retreats. I think this is a meaningful buff to Hercules, even though it's probably a minor one. Last up, Electro, and I think this one misses the mark just a bit, because it's adding power to Electro, but, like, I don't know. Most Electro draws that involve you playing Electro, your hope is that you blink it anyway. So it's like, okay, in the world where I play Electro into War Machine, this is better. And again, could be extremely relevant. We just talked about Storm War Machine Legion, right? But I don't know, like, I feel like 1 point on Electro is less than a point, because in so many of your games, your goal is to blink him away anyway, right? Like, you're not actually getting a points value out of this guy unless he stays on the board, and a lot of your lines in an Electro deck involve him not staying on the board. And so, whether that be through the very common blink or the slightly less common, but not necessarily worse, misery, there are things to keep in mind here where, like, this is a buff where it's like, it doesn't have as much of an impact as one point elsewhere on another card that actually mostly stays on the board would have. That is not irrelevant, though. Because I do think that, like, if they made Electro a 3/5, suddenly it'd be like, okay, I'm Electroing into War Machine, and I just feel actively good about it. And that's probably somewhere there can't go. But Electro getting that point, I feel like at endgame, when you have access to all the cards, it's going to matter a lot less. In a world where you're, like, picking up cards through Series 3, I think this actually could be a really relevant buff. It's just likely not to be incredibly relevant at endgame. Hello. Alright, y'all, thank you so much for watching the video. Let me know what you think about this patch in the comments. Is it everything you hoped it to be? I know there's another OTA in only a week, so we're getting a double dose of OTAs. It seems impossible to me that the next one is going to be this big, but I am interested to see what they do. As always, I have been KMBest, you have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.